after so many delaying actions and rearguard engagements, after seeing so many of their comrades die at the hands of the enemy, after enduring months of almost no provisions, the time has finally come in the Kokoda Track. The recent failures in Guadalcanal, coupled with the Japanese inability to adequately create a supply line, has finally forced General Horii and his relentless South Seas Detachment to begin their retreat northwards. Now it's up to the courageous Australians on New Guinea to at last start their counteroffensive. So join us as we delve into this important chapter of the Pacific War with the second battle on Eora Creek and Templeton's Crossing. As our long-term viewers know, we're big fans of fantasy, sci-fi, space opera, alternative history, and more. And we're happy that we're living in an age where so many fantasy and sci-fi shows and movies are being made. If you share our passion, then you'd certainly like our Wizards and Warriors channel, where we cover the lore of so many universes. For fans of Tolkien's Middle-earth, we just released a 2-hour documentary on the economy of his universe, while another 3-hour documentary describes the War of the Ring in detail, with all of its battles. If you want more, this month we're going to start releasing videos on the history of the First Age of Middle-earth. If you like your fantasy a bit more grim-dark, check out our 2-hour video on the rise and fall of the Targaryen dynasty, a good lore companion for your House of the Dragon binge. At the same time, our ongoing series is covering the War of the Five Kings in the Song of Ice and Fire universe. You want more long videos? Watch our documentaries on the life and battles of Sigmar, on the Nilfgaardian Wars, and the history of the Septim Empire. There's always more. We're currently covering Star Wars lore with a series on the Galactic Civil War, while fans of Warhammer Fantasy should check out our coverage of the End Times period. And those who know what is the best in life are going to enjoy our coverage of the battles of Conan the Barbarian. There's something for everyone, and we're putting all of our love and skill into this channel, so please consider subscribing, watching, liking, sharing, and commenting. All links in the description and pinned comment. Back on September 24th, the Japanese withdrawal from Eora Biwa had begun. The 2nd Battalion of Major Horii would be the first to pull back, forming the Stanley Detachment early on with some other units. Their objective was to set up defensive positions leading to the high ground overlooking Eora Creek, so that they could delay any Australian pursuit of withdrawing troops. The 3rd Battalion of Colonel Kawada would then start to retreat by September 26th, with the Koiwai Battalion protecting its rear, and with one of its companies advancing 500 meters as rearguard cover to disguise the withdrawal. 2 days later, the Australian counterattack began, but they were surprised to find no Japanese opposition at Eora Biwa. Brigadier Ether then rapidly occupied the area with his forces, and although there was no immediate pursuit of the enemy because they were wary of advancing into a trap, patrols were sent forward as far as Nauru, where they also discovered no Japanese presence at all. As for the invaders, their withdrawal was carried out under dreadful physical conditions, as the troops of the South Seas Detachment were completely exhausted, they almost didn't have any food, and they also had to carry their wounded on stretchers all the way back over the Owen Stanley Range. Every step seemed to sap the last of each soldier's strength, so climbing even the smallest hill required a great effort. In the last days of September, General Horii's men would slowly trail up and along the Maguli Range before reaching the hazardous ravines and razorbacks of Eora Creek. By the beginning of October, the Australians were also pushing once more across the Kokoda Track, and at the same time, General MacArthur was planning to employ the 126th and 128th Regiments, which had previously landed in September under the 1st Corps of Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, to support the counteroffensive of General Allen's 7th Division, with the objective of driving the Japanese northwards to the Kumusi River line. Yet the problem of supply, required to bring these forces to the front, continued to haunt the Allied command, so General Blamey instead intended to use only the 25th and 16th Brigades for the immediate counteroffensive. Only one American battalion would be sent along the Jora Trail to cut off the Japanese retreat at Wairopi. Yet the difficult jungle terrain would make them arrive too late and weakened to fight. Furthermore, a special unit would be flown to Wanagila on October 5th to establish a forward base from where the Americans could join the counteroffensive from a third line of advance. By October 2nd, meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion had occupied Nauru and its leading company was at Minari, continuing to Afogi without opposition. Not long after Afogi was occupied, patrols from the 3rd and 2nd 25th Battalions clashed with the Japanese rearguard between Miola and Templeton's Crossing on October 8th, but the Australians would be easily repelled, forced to retreat back to Miola. Because of this, and because of the supply problem, Brigadier Ether had to wait to assemble his 4 battalions at Afogi before continuing forward. In the end, Allen would order him to concentrate on Kagi and Miola to await for the arrival of the 16th Brigade of Brigadier John Lloyd, while Allen and General Horii sought to build a reserve with an accelerated air supply program. At the same time, Horii had been ordered to set up an offensive base at Isurava and to secure defensive positions in the Buna and Girua areas, from where the Japanese offensive would restart. But the retreat had plummeted the Japanese morale. The soldiers felt abandoned by their superiors, and thus many were deserting and running away. In these conditions, no Japanese offensive would ever commence. As Horii's forces finally started to reach Isurava, the Stanley Detachment had also successfully completed defensive preparations around Eora Creek, setting up many holding positions on strategic points of both tracks leading to Templeton's Crossing. On October 11th, Ether sent the 2nd 33rd and 2nd 25th Battalions to seize Templeton's Crossing, with the first contact occurring on the moss forests of the Miola Arm. Although the Australians pushed their way as noiselessly as possible in search of machine gun pits, the Japanese managed to hold tenaciously from one-man holes, which were effectively camouflaged with branches, leaves and grass. On the Kagi Track, some 150 Japanese soldiers had also dug in along the ridge of Mount Bellamy, and they would also have to repel the Australians on October 13th. The high ground effectively enabled them preemptive fire on any approaching enemy, and the steepness of the ridges prevented outflanking. Yet they also had to endure heavy and incessant downpours that made it difficult to see a patrol approaching. Despite this, the Japanese snipers had successfully pinned down the 2nd 25th by October 14th, when a particularly heavy rain unexpectedly brought a lull in the action. The following day, Ether decided to send the 3rd Battalion to attack the enemy and break through their left flank. Yet, unbeknownst to him, the Japanese had taken advantage of the unexpected downpour to withdraw from their positions into a second line at Templeton's Crossing, thus expertly employing the same delaying tactics that they had suffered during the Kokoda Track offensive. Finding no enemy opposition, the Australians then arduously pushed forward through the mud and against mortar fire, arriving at Templeton's Crossing on October 16th. The following morning, the 3rd Battalion led the attack against the entrenched Stanley Detachment, which had been reinforced with an additional battalion, achieving some early gains against the invaders with grenades and machine gun fire. From some heavily fortified and camouflaged bunkers, the Japanese would continue to offer staunch resistance, even attempting some counterattacks that inflicted many casualties on the enemy. Still, the Australians continued to advance against the intense Japanese fire, gradually pushing back the invaders towards their final line at Eora village. At this point, General Allen was receiving much pressure from MacArthur and Blamey, as they felt that he wasn't attacking with sufficient energy. But the Australians still decided to wait until the 16th Brigade could arrive to relieve Ether's spent forces. On October 19th, the 2nd Battalion was the first to arrive to the battlefield to assist the 3rd Battalion against the Japanese counterattacks. While Lloyd's other forces relieved the 2nd 25th and 2nd 23rd Battalions, the Australians on the front then commenced a series of fierce attacks that slowly pushed back the enemy. After a heavy firefight, and with the Australians getting nearer and nearer to their defensive line, the Japanese would have to withdraw again during a lull in the fighting on the night of October 20th, this time to their last line on the other side of the Eora Creek ravine. By October 20th, the 3 battalions of the 16th Brigade had also finally concentrated at Templeton's Crossing, and now Lloyd was officially taking command of Marlborough Force from Brigadier Ether to resume the offensive with his own battalions. The following morning, the Australians cautiously resumed their attacks, but were again surprised to find that the enemy was gone. They then continued pushing along the track, only to find small clusters of Japanese soldiers waiting in ambush, thus losing many scouts against the surprise fire of the enemy. At this point, the problem of supply continued to haunt both forces, and the village gardens on the track that had sustained the combatants before had now been already plundered during the Japanese offensive. Although the Australians were also very hungry, the Japanese were much worse. On the verge of starvation, they dragged the bodies of the Australians killed in recent skirmishes back to their dugouts, like wild animals taking dead prey to their lairs. In the meantime, General Horii had positioned his main defences on the northern ridge, overlooking Eora village, spreading his men along and below the ridge to stall the enemy advance. From their network of machine gun posts and fire trenches up above, the Japanese had a clear view of arrivals on the ridge to the south, something that would be deadly for the Australians. On the morning of October 22nd, 2 companies of the 2nd 3rd Battalion entered Eora village, getting completely surprised as mortar and machine gun fire raked them. The Australians then tried to work up the ridge above the Japanese on the left, but by early afternoon they were blocked by the defenders, forced to concentrate on the southern ridge, where they were unexpectedly pounded with mortars and shells. Many losses were inflicted on the startled Australians during this action, resulting in a disorderly withdrawal back up the slope. Assessing the situation, Brigadier Lloyd decided to order a frontal attack across 2 log bridges that crossed Eora Creek, a plan that was disliked by his battalion commanders, but that had been forced upon him and upon General Allen by the pressures of MacArthur and Blamey. During the night, however, as the Australians had shown no inclination to do night attacks, the Japanese had retired under a heavy rain to positions behind the second bridge, intending to return just before dawn. At 0200 on October 23rd, the rain ceased, and the Australians quickly started their attack. Some patrols of the 2nd 1st and 2nd 3rd Battalions rapidly got to secure the bridges ahead unopposed, and taking advantage of the situation, the 2nd 1st then began to move to the other side before the enemy could realize what was happening. Eventually, the Japanese started to open fire from above, but the darkness prevented them from stopping the enemy. Furthermore, 2 companies had also swung off the track earlier, one to reach Alola by bypassing the main Japanese positions, and the other to outflank the enemy on the left. At the same time, the 2nd 1st soldiers were moving blindly and dodging bullets as they went. By dawn, after overcoming much opposition below the ridge, they would find themselves precariously dug in and largely pinned down in front of the main Japanese position. Hemmed in, the Australians would continue to resist for several days in a battle of attrition that inflicted considerable losses on both sides, with neither moving decisively forward nor back. In this stalemate, Lloyd ordered the 2nd 3rd Battalion to move to a high ground to the west, and then attack down on the Japanese positions. Facing much opposition, however, the Australians would struggle to break through to the top, although they were beginning to apply heavy pressure on the enemy. Meanwhile, Horii moved his forces back 500 meters to stronger positions on a steeper part of the slope, and he also reinforced them with the Koiwai Battalion on October 26th. He would then prepare his forces for a final withdrawal towards Kokoda 2 days later, with the Koiwai Battalion acting as rearguard. On October 27th, 2 companies of the 2nd 1st Battalion and a company of the 2nd 2nd joined the 2nd 3rd as the Japanese withdrew to their more compact position. Although the Australians quickly pushed forward to break through, they would be easily stopped at a great cost in men. Yet the pressure was now increasing with each passing hour, and the Japanese would only just manage to hold their positions until the date of the withdrawal. The Australians, however, were also in a very bad situation, as they were always wet from the cold and rain, and they couldn't even light fires lest they became clear targets for the Japanese mortars. The incessant rain also turned the already turbulent waters of the creek into a raging torrent that destroyed the bridges, so the movement of supplies and wounded back and forth was severely hampered. At first light on October 28th, as Horii's 1st and 2nd Battalion began to disengage and retreat, the Australians renewed their attack with much more ferocity and in a coordinated manner. Colonel Kokoda to the west bore the brunt of the attack, caught between two companies of the 2nd 3rd Battalion that had managed to climb onto higher ground until a dense mist rolled in to mask the final withdrawal of the defenders. Many of these troops would, however, get lost in the dark jungle, and they would only manage to rejoin their battalion below Isurava 2 days later. On the morning of October 29th, Australian patrols finally found that the Japanese had abandoned their positions, thus ending the engagement. From this battle, it is reported that the Australians suffered almost twice as many casualties as their enemy, and this is often attributed to Lloyd's criticised decision to launch a frontal attack at Eora Creek. But we must also understand that Horii had expertly set up ideal defensive positions that were strongly and tenaciously manned by his men. And in the end, General Allen would also be replaced as commander of the 7th Division by Major General George Vassie on October 28th, as Blamey and MacArthur felt that his progress hadn't been fast enough for their liking. Thus Allen joined Potts and Rowell as the 3rd man that was purged by Blamey and MacArthur due to alleged incompetence, when these 3 men were actually the main reason that the Japanese could be successfully delayed and exhausted long enough for their offensive to fail and for the Australians to finally start their counteroffensive. After the Japanese withdrawal, the 16th Brigade would then continue their advance in hot pursuit of the enemy, capturing and setting up their new main supply base at Alola by the end of the month. Meanwhile, Horii would continue past Kokoda during his withdrawal, as the major town was extremely vulnerable to an attack from behind. The retreating Japanese headed instead to the high ground around Oivi, near the Kamusi River, where the South Seas Detachment would prepare for its final stand. Next week, join us as we turn to Guadalcanal for the 3rd and final Japanese offensive against the US Marines, in another pivotal moment of the Pacific War. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell button if you don't want to miss the upcoming videos in this series. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.